Thanks for joining us for the Delphi Debrief here on WTHR Plus. I'm Anne-Marie Tiernan, and tonight we're hearing from the families of Abby Williams and Libby German after Richard Allen was given the maximum sentence for their murders. It was 130 years, that sentence handed down by Judge Frances Gull today. And the gag order affecting the case and all the key actors finally is lifted today. Our Bob Siegel was in the courtroom as the sentence was handed down. Also, our Emily Longnecker heard from police, family, and also the prosecutor about that decision today. And they join us now. Hi there, Bob.
Hi, Ann. Yeah, as you mentioned, 130 years. That is the maximum possible that Richard Allen was facing. And Judge Fran Gull, no mercy today. She had no problem giving the full maximum sentence to Richard Allen for the murders of Abby and Libby because of what she called the heinous nature of the murders. And at the same time that we got that sentence handed down, Emily, we had that gag order finally lifted. So we got to hear from people we haven't heard from in a really long time.
Yeah, a long time, nearly 2 years. Prosecutor Nick McClellan spoke. We're going to get into a list of all the different people that spoke at that press conference, but basically they wanted folks to know, look, we are keeping the focus here on Abby and Libby, even though they also talked about Richard Allen a bit and his team's plans to appeal. So we're going to get into some of the things they said about that.
We want to let you know, again, remind you exactly where we are. Directly behind us is the Carroll County Courthouse where today's sentencing hearing took place. We have an office space on Courthouse Square just across the street here from the courthouse. That is where the hearing took place this morning. We're going to walk you through exactly what happened in court and what happened afterwards at the press conference. Emily was at that. First, we like to get started by explaining to you who we heard from today. Inside the courtroom, we'll start with that. Then, Emily, you can talk about who we heard from outside the courtroom. In the courtroom, we heard from Indiana State Police Investigator Jerry Holman, and then we heard victim impact statements from 6 family members of Abby and Libby. We heard from Libby's mom, Carrie Timmons. We heard from Libby's cousin, Josh Lank. And then we heard from Abby's grandparents, Diane and Eric Erskine, and Libby's grandparents, Becky and Mike Patty.
Right, and we also heard from Mike Patty afterwards at the news conference. We had a whole list of folks there. The news conference started out with Mike Patty, Libby's grandfather. Then we heard from Carroll County Sheriff Tony Liggett. After that, Indiana State Police Superintendent Doug Carter. Finally, Carroll County Prosecutor Nick McClellan. And after the press conference was over, we were approaching people to see if we could talk to them. And we actually talked to Kathy Schenk, who was that volunteer that found that tip sheet, found that file. Came to investigators 2 years ago and said, hey, I think you need to look at this. And it was that then that launched them into speaking to Richard Allen again and eventually leading to his arrest. And we'll talk about how they thanked her today and said that we are here today really because of her finding that tip sheet.
All right, so let's start with the headline, 130 years. The sentence, 130 years behind bars for Richard Allen. That is what Judge Frances Gull determined today. She didn't hesitate to hand down the maximum sentence because she told Allen, I want to show you exactly what she said in court today. She told Allen, you rank right up there with the most heinous crimes that Judge Gull had seen in the 27 years presiding over murder trials. And the judge said, these families will deal with your carnage forever. So Richard Allen, he came into court this morning. He was in handcuffs and he was in ankle chains and he wore an orange jail jumpsuit. And he didn't really show any emotion during the sentencing hearing. Judge Gull actually called him out for rolling his eyes at the judge as she was talking to him. And then she imposed the sentence. And you might be wondering how she came up with 130 years. And Emily and I, we want to go ahead and explain that to you. And we've got this dry erase board, not high tech, but we're hoping this will explain the sentencing guidelines and how this works. So, Emily, there were 4 counts that Richard Allen was facing.
Right. And we got rid of these top 2 because you can't be tried twice for the same crime. You can't serve a sentence for the same crime.
Exactly. So count 1 and count 2, felony murder for the murder of Abby and the murder of Libby. Count 3 and 4. that Richard Allen was facing the murder of Abby and the murder of Libby. And as Emily just explained, you can't be sentenced for killing one person more than once. So today in court, if you want to go ahead and cross these out, basically count 1 and count 2, we got rid of those. And those each brought anywhere between 45 and 65 years under the sentencing guidelines. So that means this 45 to 60 years, that got erased, this got erased. We've got these 2 murder charges left, count 3 and count 4. Judge Gull decided to go with the maximum, the 65 years for each of these. So you add those up, that's where we get the 130-year sentence that we saw today for Richard Allen.
Yeah, and a lot of times, though, by state statute, judges in the sentencing, they start right in the middle at 55, an advisory sentence. That's what Katie Jackson-Lindsay, our legal expert, was explaining to me yesterday, and then they go up or down for mitigating and aggravating factors, as she explained that to me, but it looks like Judge Gull went right to 65.
She did the 65, and I want to explain real quick, like you just said. So there are mitigating factors that can be taken into consideration, or aggravating factors. So the aggravating factors that were introduced today, we'll talk about those in a second, but the mitigating factors, no prior record. And Judge Gull mentioned that absolutely true, no prior criminal record for Richard Allen, but she said she really wasn't going to take that into consideration very much based on just how heinous the crime was. And then there was the hardship that being incarcerated would place on Kathy Allen, on Richard's wife. She said anytime you sentence someone to prison, there's going to be a hardship, so she wasn't going to take that into consideration. She said his mental illness she didn't think was really related to the murders, so she didn't take that into consideration. And she said his prior military service with the National Guard, she wasn't going to consider that either. So there was really little or no impact at all with those possible mitigating factors that could have brought the sentence down.
Right, and some of the aggravating factors that I was talking with Katie about yesterday would be had Richard Allen been in a place of trust with these young girls, and as Katie explained to me, no, that's not the case. He didn't know them. So she talked about some of those aggravators, but in that sentencing memorandum that the defense filed yesterday, they listed some of those mitigating factors that you talked about, and they let us know that basically they weren't going to have much to say today, nor would Richard Allen, nor would his family, because essentially we learned yesterday that they're planning to appeal.
So the main aggravating factor, again, that really played a role in giving the maximum sentence was just how horrible the crime scene was, how horrible the murders were. And want to point out, Carroll County Prosecutor Nick McLeland, he specifically asked the judge to impose the maximum sentence. And what he said in court today, he told the judge, Richard Allen is a danger to the community, and he's the worst kind of danger, the kind who can kill 2 girls and then go on with his life. And State Police Investigator Jerry Holman, who took the stand as really the only witness today, he told the judge that Allen treated his victims like animals, stalking and humiliating them before he brutally killed them. So, again, painting a picture of a gruesome, graphic crime scene and the intentional steps that they say that Richard Allen went through to commit these murders. Now, they were not the only ones who asked Judge Gull for a very harsh sentence to be handed down to Richard Allen. The families of Abby and Libby also asked for the harshest penalty possible. The families were here today, as they have been throughout the trial. 6 of Abby and Libby's relatives presented emotional victim impact statements during the hearing. Libby's mother, Carrie Timmons, spoke directly to Richard Allen when she said, "I'll never understand how you were able to get away with this for so long." And she told the judge she was left with a literal hole in my soul following the murder of her daughter. Abby's grandmother, Diane Erskine, told the court, "This is not a day of celebration. This is a day of great sadness." And she said, "I will never be the same person I was before Abigail's murder." And some family members used their statements to lash out at Allen. Libby's cousin Josh Lank said, Allen put the victims' families through a living hell for the past 8 years. And looking right at Allen, he said, "Now it's time for your life to be a living hell." And Libby's grandmother, Becky Patty, told Allen she hopes he lives the rest of his life in prison with the same sense of fear he instilled in his victims. Then she told the court, "I live every day with the burden of having allowed Abby and Libby to go to the trails that day, and I take responsibility for that. What about you, Richard Allen? Will you ever take responsibility for your actions that day?" Who we did not hear from in court, Richard Allen. He told the judge he did not wish to make any statement. We did not hear from Allen's family. They were not in court today, and we are told that was at Richard Allen's request. We also heard very little from Allen's defense team. After court, just a brief statement from attorney Jennifer Auger.
What they went through is unimaginable. We're looking forward to the next steps in our appeals. Other than that, we have nothing to say.
Again, very little today from the defense at all. We do know that Richard Allen has 30 days to file his appeal. Right. Judge Gull told him that before he left the courtroom today and was led away. And we know that that appeal is coming.
Right, it is coming. I mean, and we knew that it was coming yesterday, right? When they filed that sentencing memorandum, letting us know that they felt that Richard Allen's constitutional rights had been violated, both from the solitary confinement, and they basically said they didn't want him participating in that pre-sentence investigation report. They didn't want him interacting with state actors, is what the memo said, because of what had happened before. And they talked about the prison psychologist that was assigned to him, that had a high interest in the case and discussed confidential matters with him. So we kind of had some idea yesterday from that sentencing memorandum that we weren't going to hear from Richard Allen. We were not going to hear from his family, and that even his defense team was probably going to say very little in court.
Exactly. So we'll talk more about the appeal coming up here in a little bit. Do want to mention immediately after the hearing, Richard Allen was placed back into custody with the Indiana Department of Correction. He had been for the last several months at the Cass County Jail after he successfully convinced Judge Gull and his defense team convinced her to move him out of the Department of Correction. We now know he is back there. We don't know exactly and which prison he is at right now, but tonight he has already started serving that 130-year sentence that was announced here in Carroll County.
All right, Bob and Emily, thanks so much. We'll check back. In the meantime, I want to get a little bit deeper dive right now with our legal analyst, Katie Jackson-Lindsay, joining us live here in studio. We're going to talk a little bit about those proceedings today leading up to that decision of a 130-year sentence. Nothing really from the defense, no participation from Richard Allen or his team as far as trying to argue or influence in any way the judge's decision today. Is that unusual?
That is unusual, and it goes along with sort of the unusual journey that we've been on with this case. It is unusual, but it was really appropriate for the facts that they have been handed in this case. And what I mean by that is that they're absolutely correct in their memorandum. Everything that Richard Allen has done up until this point in terms of cooperating with the police, giving the police the tip that he was on the trail that day, talking to state actors within the Department of Correction, all of those things have been used as evidence against him. And so it was really brilliant lawyering on their part to suggest that he not cooperate in that pre-sentence investigation, because anything that he said about the facts of the case to that pre-sentence investigator, anything that he said about his own mental health could be used against him later if there is another trial on this case. So that was really good advocacy on their part to take that approach, even though it's unusual.
Very unusual.
Yes.
And when we were hearing there in Bob and Emily's analysis of what was said today in court, it stood out to me that Richard Allen's mental health was not a factor, was not considered a factor by the judge in this sentence. That stood out to me. Did it stand out to you too?
It does stand out to me because that is a mitigating factor that she can consider. And it is a mitigating factor that should be considered as it relates to any criminal defendant, because any criminal conviction requires that the defendant had the mental capability, and culpability is the word that we use, to commit the crime. So to reject that as a mitigating factor altogether does seem a bit unusual to me. But again, that's another one of those things that's within her discretion to do, and that's her sentencing statement.
130 years, surprised by that? Anything else stand out to you from those proceedings in the courtroom this morning?
It's not a surprise to me that he was sentenced to the 130-year maximum based on her sentencing statement and the reasons that she gave. One of the things that we are to adhere to in terms of our sentencing guidelines within our state sentencing scheme is that maximum sentences are reserved for the worst offenders. And in her sentencing statement to Richard Allen, Judge Gull said that this is among the most heinous and hideous crimes that I've seen in 27 years on this bench. And so that was the way that she supported giving that maximum sentence. If she truly believes that he ranks among the worst of the worst, then a maximum sentence is appropriate.
All right, thanks so much for that, Katie. Let's go back to Bob and Emily. We were talking about what was going on inside the courtroom, but a lot of people there in that community in Delphi and Carroll County have gathered and been following this case. Let's go back to Bob and Emily for a reaction of what happened outside of the courtroom today after that. There was a presser, I understand, after that sentencing was handed down.
Yeah, there was a press conference. You know, as soon as the hearing ended today, the family stayed inside to talk with the prosecutor, and there were discussions that happened there that we were not privy to. And then the family started to come out of the courthouse, and they let us know that they were going to be heading over, some of them at least, were going to be heading over to the press conference. And Emily, you were right there, had a front seat for that.
Yeah, they did, and many of the family members were there. I saw Mike and Becky Patty. Mike Patty actually spoke at the presser. Law enforcement were also there, and they spoke. You know, among law enforcement, they got the chance to say some things that they have wanted to say for a while, but couldn't because of that gag order, and they were, you know, able to address some of those things today. A lot of it, a lot of thank yous actually today. A lot of thanking all around Nick McClelland, thanking his team. He also thanked Kathy Shank. You know, she's the volunteer who came across that tip in the fall of 2022, that tip sheet, and then that file in the bottom of a banker's box. We remember hearing during trial, and Shank had been a volunteer, and she had helped scan and sort files throughout the investigation. She came across this tip, she handed it over, she took it to investigators, and within months we know Richard Allen was under arrest. Here's Nick McClelland thanking Shank at today's press conference, and then we got to talk to Kathy Shank herself. Take a listen.
Without her, we would not be here. Without her, we would not have an arrest, a conviction, and a sentence. She was the key part to this investigation, the needle in the haystack, if you will, that brought this investigation to a close to where we could make an arrest. Kathy Shank, I thank you.
I realized that this was a person who we had not discussed, and when I read the tip and the subsequent report, because I had been an investigator for the 40 years prior, I took it to Tony Liggett and I said, please look at this. I think this is something we need to look at. And he said, yes, it is. I basically said 2 and 2 equals 4, and that's what led me to it.
Yeah, 2 and 2 equals 4. McClelland also took an opportunity to thank Abby and Libby. He talked about that cell phone video that Libby took on her phone that day of Bridge Guy, that she had the presence of mind, the wherewithal to record that video, and then later Abby hiding that phone under her body. That's where law enforcement could then find it, saying, you know, that the killer was not able to take that, and he said, arguably, you know, that was the biggest piece of evidence that we had. I mean, that was...
What an incredible piece of evidence for a gift for investigators.
A gift, literally a gift, and that's something Mike Patty has said to me over the years, that Libby was scrappy, she was smart, she knew when something wasn't right, and he was so proud of her that she knew to take that video, and that really tracked with the kind of young lady that she was. And we heard from Mike Patty today. He's the only family member that spoke at the news conference. His remarks were pretty brief, and just given, you know, I guess how emotional it was in court, I was not able to be in there, but he kept his remarks here in this community forum pretty brief. He thanked the Delphi community for standing by the family for almost 8 years. He said, you know, if I get to 80 years of my life, 10% of it will have been spent on this case. He thanked the investigators and the prosecution. He thanked Judge Gull, he said, for staying steadfast and getting the family through this. And he also thanked the jury. Take a listen to this.
I really wanted to take the time to send out my appreciation that justice has been served for the girls. I want to thank the jurors. Hope they get a chance to see this, that they took time out of their lives and remained open-minded and objective and was able to look at the information and deliver a verdict. For that, I will always be grateful.
We also heard from Indiana State Police Superintendent Doug Carter. Carter said he was reminded that it had been 2,866 days since this all began. He said that justice was served, and he hoped that people could heal now and tone down some of the rhetoric that has sometimes surrounded this case. And in an interview later, Carter said that he still asks why, and that he hopes at some point Richard Allen will apologize.
Richard Allen has a conscience. And he's going to have a lot of time to stare at a concrete ceiling and think about what he did. You know, the truth will set him free. Not literally, but the truth will set him free in his heart and in his mind and his conscience. I mean, I'm not going to hide my faith. Pretty faithful guy. And none of this matters other than what he thinks. And right now, he's pretty disappointed in Richard Allen.
Carter said he's not disappointed in Richard Allen in the fact that Richard Allen wants to appeal. He says that's all part of it. And Doug Carter even saying he would probably appeal too. Another point that was really interesting in this press conference, Nick McClellan was asked about something that he said 2 years ago at that press conference when they announced Richard Allen's arrest. At the time, he talked about the possibility that this investigation was continuing and the possibility that there were more people involved. That's what he said 2 years ago. Today, when he was asked about that, he said that he did not believe that others were involved, that they had no evidence of that. But he said if someone brings them that evidence, they'll certainly investigate, even saying that if Allen wants to talk to them himself and come forward with information, they would gladly accept that. So we also heard from Carroll County Sheriff Tony Liggett. He talked about the pain that this community has gone through, that this was a community that for years people slept with their doors open, people felt safe, and he hoped that this conviction and sentence brought some of that security back. But he also talked about the fact that really there ultimately is no closure. Here's what he had to say.
I keep hearing the word closure. People are coming up to me saying, I bet that you're glad that there's finally closure. There will never be any closure in this case. The Germans and the Williams family lost their daughters, their granddaughters, their siblings. Justice, a form of justice was served, but it does not bring Abby or Libby back. These families will live every day without two of the most important people in their lives. They're missing milestones because of a low-life coward decided to take their innocent lives. They did not deserve this. Today is not closure. It is just turning the page and starting a new chapter.
And much of this press conference, the focus did stay on Abby and Libby, but Richard Allen was brought up a few times. Prosecutor Nick McClellan talked about the fact that during the trial he felt that Richard Allen showed no remorse, no regret, and really no emotion, according to Nick McClellan, when those crime scene photos were up there. And we know that, you know, the next chapter in this, that Allen's attorneys intend to appeal this, and McClellan had this suggestion instead.
If he truly wants to apologize to the families and admit to what he's done, now's the time to do that.
Another key moment in this press conference, Bob, Sheriff Tony Liggett, he apologized to the families, saying that he was sorry that it had taken this long, 8 years, almost 8 years to get to this point. And he referenced something that Becky Patty said would ultimately be the goal when all of this, when she was asked, you know, what would you like to say? What would your goal be for the thing that you would like to say? And Sheriff Liggett said that he hung this quote on his refrigerator, on his computer, and he looked at this all the time. And Becky Patty used to say that she wanted to be able to say, there is zero doubt that justice has been served, and today is the day. And so listening to these families talk, listening to these law enforcement talk today, they feel that justice was served today.
So we know there was discussion today, both in the courtroom and then afterward at the press conference, about next steps, about a possible appeal. And the victims' families actually addressed that right inside the courtroom today, looking directly at Richard Allen, appealing to him not to appeal. In the words of Libby's grandfather, Mike Patty, he said, "Let the girls rest in peace." And Emily, I get the sense really from the statements in court today, the very emotional statements, that the families are wanting a rest from this. They're not wanting to go through an entire process of appeal. Carrie Timmons, Libby's mom, said that she has a literal hole in her soul, she told the judge. Abby's grandmother said that she has nightmares, she seldom sleeps through the night. And her grandfather said losing Abby was like losing a limb that never grows back. Libby's grandmother said the defense team throughout the trial and throughout this whole process seemed like they were twisting a knife in the family's pain, and that's what it felt like going through this whole process. They do not want there to be an appeal, but when we step back, we know that there are multiple areas throughout this 2+ years since the arrest that are going to be appealed. And we've got a list of those things. There is the Odinism theory that Judge Gull would not allow to be introduced at trial. We know that the defense team, they believe that the killings of the girls was related to this Norse ritualistic pagan sacrifice that they say took place there, the way the sticks were laid on the bodies, the branches there, and blood on the trees. They brought in an expert to say this looks like it is very much linked to that type of a killing, and Judge Gull said there was not enough of a nexus there, a link, to be able to introduce that. So she ruled out all that evidence that the defense wanted to present. There were the composite sketches that the prosecutor asked specifically to be left out of this case, and the judge granted that. The defense wanted to say, look, those sketches that were introduced show people that look perhaps very different than the defendant. The confessions and the mental health of Richard Allen, the judge allowed those things. The defense said should not have been allowed in. There's a number of things that the defense is going to take to the Court of Appeals. And then we also have to remember that during this process, we heard the family thank Judge Gull for taking a hard stand on many of these things throughout the trial, but it's worth pointing out Judge Gull did make mistakes during this process. For example, she kicked the public defenders off the case. Right. This went to the Indiana Supreme Court before it ever came here to Delphi. And the Supreme Court justices were pretty much beside themselves. They ordered Judge Gull to put the defense team back on the case, basically an indication she had very much overstepped her bounds. There were multiple situations where Judge Gull permitted records that were supposed to be in the public light where she did not require those to be entered into the public record. There were situations where evidence and things that were introduced were not allowed to be seen, and it wasn't until the media intervened that she finally gave in on those things. So this now goes to the Indiana Court of Appeals. That's the next step, and the defense team is going to be asking the judge, asking those judges on the Court of Appeals to take a look at the way that Judge Gull conducted this trial, the decisions she made, to see if there were other errors or mistakes that were made, and we've already seen that some were made in this trial.
I mean, and of course, obviously, as you said, if you ask the family, and Mike Patty saying today, thanking Judge Gull, you know, in his opinion, for being steadfast and getting the family through this. So, I mean, obviously, if you ask the families of the victims, they feel that all of her decisions were correct, but obviously, the defense, you know, has some things that they would like to bring up.
And they will.
And they will.
And they will. And we will see whether or not the Court of Appeals decides that there were any errors that were made that would be significant enough that they could potentially violate the constitutional rights of Richard Allen. And if they decide there are, they'll remand the case back. And if not, then this will be over.
What did you make of, I wanted to ask you, what you got to be in the courtroom. I was outside waiting in line. You know, what did you kind of make of the atmosphere in the court today? I mean, I found it kind of surreal that I was, you know, waiting, and here were all these Christmas trees, and there was Christmas music playing, and here we were in this really, really heavy moment at this, you know, joyful time of year, the holidays, and people are excited to be with their families, and it was just, you know, I found the atmosphere to be surreal, at least outside.
I think that Abby's grandmother said it best. She said, "This is not a day for celebration, for champagne." She said, "This is a very sad day." And again, there's no winners on a day like today. We have two young ladies, two girls who are murdered. And as the family pointed out today, no matter what the sentence today, Abby and Libby are not coming back. Right. They say their legacy is going to live on, but those girls are not coming back. So, Libby would have a birthday coming up. I believe her 22nd birthday coming up in just a few days. They say they should be celebrating the holidays and celebrating that birthday. They don't get to do that.
You know, another thing that, and again, I wasn't in the courtroom, but hearing, I think it was Becky Patty, hearing that she talked about the generational trauma of having those photos of the crime scene leaked out there at one point, and just having to see those and then kind of being re-victimized. And that's something that they brought up in this press conference today, that and kind of saying to the media and anyone there, if you receive these photos, delete them. Like, don't pass them on. This is re-victimizing and traumatizing the family. And they talked about the fact that those got out there, and the responsibility that the people have. But of course, we've seen a different situation. This is the first time I've been involved in anything where you had the legacy media, right? And then you had the podcasters and the people on their phone. And there were people in the press conference today, like, going live on their phone, talking about what was going on, and, you know, and responding to people that were maybe, I don't know, in their live thing, you know, chatting back with them. And so it was interesting to hear the investigators, more than a couple, talk about how those photos got out, and that you need to delete them, and words matter and actions matter as far as disseminating information.
There's still a lot of anger and frustration, particularly with Abby and Libby's families. And I will say, and I'm glad you brought it up, that term, that the generational impact and the generational trauma. Judge Gull was very appreciative to the families for bringing that up. She said in all of her years, she's never really thought about this idea that the actions that take place here and that trauma is generational, that this impacts generations to come. The families talked about the fact that, you know, these girls will never be able to have their own families, that they will not, you know, be able to go to their weddings, that how many grandchildren, one of the grandparents brought up, how many grandchildren might there have been that there will never be because of these murders. So, yes, this is, again, today, the end of the trial, the end of the sentencing. This is a crime, and that will be remembered not only here in Delphi, but I think across the state, across the nation for many, many years to come.
All right, Bob and Emily, thanks so much for that analysis there. Talking about how the family does not want there to be an appeal, and yet the defense is insisting that, in fact, that is going to happen. So joining us live in studio is our legal expert, Katie Jackson-Lindsay. Talking about appeals process, what do these next steps legally look like, Katie?
So the first step is that Richard Allen be appointed appellate counsel. Pauper counsel is what we call it, but that essentially just means an appellate public defender. And so his current counsel set the stage for that yesterday when they requested that the state public defender agency be appointed to represent him on appeal. Judge Gull did ultimately say that he would be appointed Pauper counsel or public defender for appeal. So now that group of attorneys, or that singular attorney, if it's just one, has 30 days to file that notice of appeal. And once they do that, that puts the court staff on notice that someone has to begin to prepare the transcripts. So every single word, every single piece of evidence from this trial is reduced to writing, so that the attorneys, first, Richard Allen's attorney, has an opportunity to formulate those arguments, review the trial, review the issues, and not just the trial, also any of those motions that were filed before trial by the defense that may have been denied, as well as motions by the state that may have been denied or granted. And then the Attorney General's office has an opportunity to respond to whatever appeal is filed on his behalf. So it can be a pretty lengthy and pretty tedious process, especially with a case like this where there's a lot to review.
And we've gotten indications that the defense are already building their case for this.
Absolutely. You know, Emily and Bob addressed some of those mistakes that have been made by Judge Gull along the way that our Supreme Court determined was absolutely a mistake. But there are some issues that the defense has raised along the way in terms of mistakes that they believe that she's making. And there was one that they raised just yesterday that could go unnoticed because it was a small nuance. It was a footnote in their sentencing memorandum indicating that Judge Gull appointed the Allen County Probation Office to do the pre-sentence investigation report, and that sort of contributed to their decision to not have him to participate in that, because by statute, the county where he's charged should do the pre-sentence investigation report. So it seemed to me that they were insinuating that she made that decision sort of arbitrarily without any sort of explanation, which if they would have just acquiesced to that, again, that could be waiving his appeal rights. So along the way, they've done a good job of making their record and also making sure that their position is clear and not waiving his rights.
So, and just to clarify, I mean, the judge is from Allen County, Fort Wayne, and she was being a special judge hearing this case in Carroll County. So the thought was maybe why not assign somebody from Carroll County rather than someone that she is maybe more have a relationship with or comfortable with in Fort Wayne.
Right, and I believe that the statute would require, I mean, he's charged in Allen County. This crime occurred in Allen County.
In Carroll
County.
County.
Yes, absolutely.
Yes,
He's charged in Carroll County. The crime occurred in Carroll County. And so Carroll County has jurisdiction. And so a Carroll County investigator should have been the person conducting this investigation. Now, there could be a completely reasonable explanation as to why that wasn't possible. But the defense's position was, if that's the case, there needs to be an explanation, and we're not going to simply waive his right to the proper process. And so that contributed to their decision to not participate in that pre-sentence investigation interview.
So we learned today that Richard Allen will receive 130 years in prison. That essentially is a life sentence given his age. People all around the world have been following this case, and they've been able to do that because of these podcasters that Emily has mentioned and the extensive coverage online and on YouTube. And we've been looking through some of the comments today and some of the reactions that have come through, and we're getting this question about, okay, 130 years, why was this not a death penalty case? Why was he not given the death penalty? Executions resumed in Indiana just this week. What kind of help explain that for these questions that we're getting from members of the audience and viewers online?
Well, and those are fair questions. Those are fair questions from the viewers, and it can be sort of a complicated concept to understand. In the state of Indiana, if you are going to pursue the death penalty or pursue a case as what we call a capital case, you have to make those intentions known from the outset. So in the state of Indiana, there's an opportunity to pursue the death penalty or life without parole, but the state has to make those intentions known from the beginning, because there's an entirely different set of rules and laws that surround those levels of punishment. Simply put, the state did not pursue that. And I'm sure that there are reasons why. We don't know those reasons at this time, but the state did not pursue the death penalty as a potential consequence here. They did not pursue life without parole as a potential consequence here. And again, they may have very good legally based reasons for that, but those weren't options available for Judge Gull. So in terms of the options available to her, she gave him the maximum possible sentence that she could. The maximum on each murder conviction after the two were left, and Emily and Bob did a great job of illustrating that. She gave him 65 for the murder of one young lady, 65 for the other, and ran them consecutive. And that was the most that she could do.
Yes. Okay. Well, thank you so much for your insight throughout this trial, really helping us really understand some of the finer points of what's going on. We do appreciate you, Katie Jackson Lindsay, for being our legal expert. And that does it for us here on the Delphi Debrief today on WTHR Plus. We are staying on top of the legal battles that are likely to continue and that follow this case as Richard Allen's team now prepares for this upcoming appeals process that they have promised that they will pursue. As always, you can find our comprehensive coverage of the Delphi murders, the trial, and now the sentencing online at WTHR.com/Delphi. I'm Anne Marie Tiernan. Thank you for watching.